This episode contains graphic content that may not be suitable for all ages. Listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you know is struggling or in crisis, help is available. Call or text 988 or chat with someone at 988lifeline.org. Those outside of the US, reach out to someone at your local crisis center or hotline. Please do not suffer in silence. Joe Rapini and David Starr were two men that lived together in Greece, New York, a northwestern suburb of Rochester. The two lived at 98 Applewood Drive and were in the midst of a happy life together in the spring of 1983. On the morning of Wednesday, April 13th, Joe had evidently come down with something. He wasn't feeling well, so he took the day off from work. David, meanwhile, still went to work that day, suspecting Joe to have contracted the simple flu. When he returned home later that day, though, he discovered that Joe was much sicker than he had originally suspected. Joe was running a serious fever and had been unable to keep anything down all day long. Out of an abundance of caution, the two decided to drop by the hospital that evening. Thankfully, the doctor that saw Joe said he did not need to stay overnight, so he could return home. Joe was administered a sedative to help him sleep that night, which would begin to take effect almost immediately. Just after 9 p.m., the two returned home from the hospital, and nothing in their neighborhood seemed to be amiss. However, as they stepped inside their home, they were greeted by a masked gunman who had broken into their home via a shattered kitchen window. When they walked in through the garage, the man was standing in the middle of their kitchen, mask on and gun raised, just waiting for them. The man handcuffed Joe's and David's hands behind them, and then had pillowcases put over their heads. They were instructed to sit on the couch and remain quiet as the gunman laid out his plan for them, which would unfold over the next several hours. While there on the couch, Joe and David were told that they were being held hostage, and that they were going to help the man rob a bank. You see, 36-year-old David was the manager of a local Columbia Banking Federal Savings and Loan Association. 40-year-old Joe was going to be held hostage by the gunman until David fetched a ransom from the bank he worked at least $70,000, and only then would Joe's safety be guaranteed. However, as the hours passed inside of Joe and David's home, the gunman laid out an additional stipulation. He wanted David to bring along the money, along with a specific woman that worked at the bank. She would then likely be taken captive by the gunman for whatever reason we could only hint at. Eventually, Joe and David were separated. David was brought down into the basement, while Joe was kept upstairs, told by the gunman to write out several handwritten notes. These notes would be used the next day to change the details of the robbery, such as the drop-off location, so that if police were to get involved, they would only have outdated information, and if the notes were found, they would only have Joe's handwriting. As far as criminal tactics go, it was pretty ingenious, and one the offender had used beforehand in his various robbery schemes. Meanwhile, down in the basement, the masked gunman drilled his instructions into David's head over and over, demanding that they be repeated back to him until it was verbatim. Early the next morning, David was allowed to leave the house unsupervised, but he was instructed to sit and wait in a parking lot near the bank, where he saw a woman in a white car driving around multiple times. File that information away for later. He arrived at the bank shortly before they were set to open at 9 a.m. and followed the instructions given to him by the gunman. He began packaging whatever money he could into a small cardboard box, and he would begin looking around for the drop-off location, given to him via a series of predetermined notes, the ones written by Joe the night beforehand. However, while at the bank, David did not bring along the female employee requested by the gunman. But according to the publication The Democrat and Chronicle, inside the bank the two had a tense and emotional exchange. The specific details never released to the public. With just the money in tow, David made a beeline for the final drop-off location along Hamlin-Parma Town Line Road, near its intersection with the Lake Ontario State Parkway. There he'd been told to leave the small box of cash among a pile of debris along the side of the road, roughly 4 or 5 feet away from the pavement. Amidst the broken appliances and the garbage laying there, the small box would likely not be noticed by anyone. While driving back from the drop-off location, David recalled driving past a woman in a white car, who he believed to be the same woman he'd seen from earlier that morning. David returned immediately to the bank after dropping off the money, and he was met there by police. They had been called to the scene by the other bank employees, who, fearing that something was going on, responsibly called 911. From there, law enforcement would begin to get involved in understanding the situation, but sadly, David's worst fears had already come to fruition. When David's partner, Joe Rapini, was found, it was in the trunk of his car. The vehicle had been parked along the 1500 block of the English Village apartment complex, along 1100 English Road in Greece, less than 2 miles away from where Joe and David lived together. Before his death, Joe had been beaten pretty significantly, with his face bruised and swollen. He had been shot twice in the chest, including once in the heart, and both .32 caliber rounds were later recovered from his torso. Surprisingly, investigators would find that each of the rounds had come from different firearms. In fact, an additional round from a third firearm had been fired into the dash of his car, indicating that Joe Rapini might have fought back against his abductor, thus explaining the beating he had taken before his death and the gunshots from different firearms. Whatever had happened in his final moments alive had undoubtedly been chaotic and frenzied, and his body was found roughly 9 hours after the money was delivered, at around 6:30 p.m. that Thursday. The Greece Police Department and the FBI would work together on the investigation into this strange bank robbery and murder, forming a task force comprised of more than 24 officers and agents, who would work around the clock for weeks. Working out of nearby Rochester, they would facilitate the posting of a $5,000 reward, the money being offered up by the bank David worked at, Columbia Federal Savings. Despite being their best hope at identifying the suspect, David Starr was unable to recall much in the way of specific details. Joe and he had been taken captive at night, when it was dark, and the gunman had worn a mask throughout most of their time together. He was, however, able to describe him as a white man between 35 and 40 years of age, who stood around 6 feet tall and weighed approximately 170 pounds, but that was just an estimate. Investigators would follow up on the multiple sightings of the woman in a white car, who had been seen driving around the bank multiple times ahead of the robbery, as well as out near the pickup location, but her identity was never established. Police theorized that she had been an accomplice to the main gunman, but whoever she was, she remains an enigma to this day. Despite their best efforts, members of the task force were unable to come up with any strong leads. The money was never recovered, and the identity of the culprit, or culprits, remained a mystery for quite some time. Yet, the agents would not be deterred that easily. George Mahoney, the supervisor of the FBI's Rochester office, told the Democrat and Chronicle in June 1983, "These things don't get written off. You have a very serious crime that's been committed. A man's life has been taken. It involves a financial institution. It's not going to be closed. No way. It'll be open until we have a solution." It wasn't until years later that authorities would hint at them finally locating a suspect. This was a man known for not just perpetrating intricate bank robbery schemes, but someone that also had a proclivity for violence. He was someone well known to law enforcement at this point, having committed almost every serious crime besides arson, who had also spent a great deal of time traversing the United States, in particular, traipsing through the Northeast, where he peppered crimes here and there, specifically in upstate New York, an area he had lived in for many years when he was younger. Mike DeBardeleben, arrested in 1983 for various counterfeiting offenses, had become known to federal agents for his variety of criminal behaviors, which had developed over many years. Beyond being an infamous counterfeiter, DeBardeleben was also an alleged rapist, kidnapper, and killer, who had been linked to more than a dozen crimes in the preceding decade, but whose true scope of depravity would never be known. Not only did Mike DeBardeleben match the description of the suspect in the bank robbery scheme involving David Starr and Joe Rapini, but the other parameters of the crime fit. A bank robbery scheme similar to the ones that DeBardeleben had used in the past? Check. Upstate New York, an area well known to Mike DeBardeleben? Check. Had the individuals been bound and forced to memorize a well-formulated script? Check. Were they asked to bring a female victim along with the ransom? Check. Over time, authorities would allege that Mike DeBardeleben was the culprit of this intricate robbery scheme, and had killed Joe Rapini when his outlandish demands were not met. Not only was the money stolen less than $70,000, but the female employee of the bank had not been delivered to him. Evidence was later found in DeBardeleben's possession linking him to this robbery murder, believed to be the journal entries he'd made that implicated knowledge of the crime. It was also determined that the crime took place at around the same time the mall passer had been traveling through the area. Yet, like many of the crimes that Mike DeBardeleben is alleged to have committed, this is one that he would never stand trial for. In fact, no trial for this case would ever come to pass. Due to his own vile actions, Mike DeBardeleben would spend the rest of his life in prison, but the truth about whatever crimes he committed died with him. We'll likely never know for sure what crimes he did or didn't commit, but because of the crimes he was convicted and reasonably accused of, we know exactly what he was. Part 6. A Man Without Morals. In the spring of 1984, James Micheal DeBardeleben Jr., better known as Mike DeBardeleben, stood trial for counterfeiting offenses in North Carolina. This was his third trial for counterfeiting to take place within the past year, having already been convicted of 2 similar crimes in Tennessee. For that reason, he was already set to spend the next 35 years in prison, but because of possible parole dates, it was likely for him to be out of prison even sooner than that. So at the time, federal prosecutors viewed this North Carolina trial as their best chance to get DeBardeleben imprisoned for life, since they could designate him as a dangerous special offender in sentencing. This was what they viewed as the actual litmus test for their case, which they had spent months building, and was centered around more than just passing bogus bills in shopping malls. The prosecution in the counterfeiting trial was actually pretty simple. DeBardeleben had been caught red-handed distributing bogus bills that he had created, which he had then spread across the country for about 4 years. They had evidence of him creating the bills, and were able to successfully make the case that Mike DeBardeleben had possessed and passed these counterfeit 20s at the Eastridge Mall in Gastonia, North Carolina. Multiple witnesses identified him as the mall passer, including his ex-wife, who testified to helping him create and distribute the bills over many months. She did so without any type of immunity deal, opening herself up to self-incrimination because she was so eager to get her abusive ex-husband off of the streets. In June of 1984, the federal jury impaneled by the U.S. District Court, made up of 7 women and 5 men, returned a guilty verdict. Judge Robert D. Potter scheduled sentencing hearings to take place that July. Because of the dangerous special offender designation being sought by prosecutors, each of the 4 counterfeiting offenses DeBardeleben had been found guilty of could earn a 25-year sentence, each to be served consecutively, instead of the 15 typically used for counterfeiting crimes at the time, which were often set to run concurrently. Assistant U.S. Attorney Ken Andreessen told Judge Potter, "I think this man's record and conviction do not fully apprise the court of this man's threat to society." Andreessen then went on to describe how investigators had discovered photographs of victims whom the defendant had brutally sodomized, along with notes written by the defendant which described in detail the acts of sodomy and sexual torture, and tape recordings made by the defendant of the actual acts of sodomy and sexual abuse. In the sentencing hearing that followed, prosecutors laid out their case, aided by the Secret Service, who had spent a year compiling the evidence that they now unveiled. This included information about DeBardeleben's various crimes across the country, the counterfeiting, the alleged bank robberies and fraud schemes, as well as the suspected rapes, kidnappings, and murders. For the first time, the evidence documented by the Secret Service task force was laid out in court. The photographs DeBardeleben had taken of his many victims, along with the audio recordings of their torture, the mass amount of police paraphernalia in his custody, handcuffs, police lights, sirens, everything you would need to impersonate a police officer, the sex toys, the depraved journals, the documentation of his travels, the things stolen from women across the country, etc. In summation, it was an incredibly damning case, which did not go quite as far as convicting DeBardeleben of the various crimes laid out in the evidence itself, but did a good job of making the case that he was a very dangerous individual who should go away for as long as humanly possible. Prosecutors made the case that DeBardeleben's counterfeit crimes had been used to finance the rest of his villainous lifestyle, thus earning him the dangerous special offender label. To prove their point, they played the audio recordings that DeBardeleben had made of his torture sessions. But per Judge Potter, were limited to just a couple of minutes from each tape to be played in court. In total, this audio was only played for a handful of minutes. But even in that limited amount of time, many inside of the courtroom had to rush out to avoid hearing something that they would never be able to forget. One tape heard a woman scream out, amidst many other horrible things. "Please set me free. Oh God, I can't stand it. I just want to die." After hearing the evidence laid out during the sentencing hearing, Judge Potter ruled in early August 1984, "It appears to this court that the defendant is a sadomasochist, a man without morals." And with that, Judge Potter sentenced Mike DeBardeleben to the maximum allowed under the law, 25 years for each of the 4 counterfeit crimes, a grand total of 100 years in federal prison. They would be served consecutively with his previous convictions, meaning that DeBardeleben was set to spend the next 135 years in prison, so far. After his conviction in the counterfeit trial in North Carolina, Mike DeBardeleben was then transported to Baltimore, Maryland, where he was set to get ready for his next trial. In that, he stood accused of kidnapping and raping a woman on Memorial Day weekend in 1979. The woman from a couple of episodes ago that I identified as Lori Jensen, not her real name. Surprisingly, in that trial, DeBardeleben decided to act as his own attorney, rejecting the public defenders provided by the court. In his filing to serve as his own counsel, he claimed that the previous 3 court-appointed attorneys, who he had all fired, had practiced conspiracy, trickery, and deceit against him. Mike DeBardeleben pleaded innocent to the federal charge of kidnapping filed against him, and began a rather strenuous process of trying to eliminate evidence against him, claiming that the evidence used to obtain the kidnapping indictment, such as the photographs, audio recordings, and other items found in his home and storage lockers, had not been properly discovered by the Secret Service. His argument hinged on the belief that they had been searching for evidence of counterfeiting at the time, and they did not have a warrant to properly seize that evidence, so them simply having it was an infringement of his Fourth Amendment rights. He also claimed that the other warrants were based on early evidence that was tainted and not specific enough, basically claiming that because federal agents had seized property that they weren't looking for during this initial search, that any charges that followed were inadmissible. In response, the prosecution would argue, "The defendant's position totally ignores the practical realities of law enforcement, and he urges the court to adopt an archaic, super-technical approach to his motion." In the most surprising twist of all, Mike DeBardeleben actually put up a pretty competent argument against the state, as noted by many journalists at the time. He seemed to know which arguments to make and when, making the judge question whether or not he had a legitimate point, even though this was the legal equivalent of a Hail Mary. DeBardeleben argued that the seizure of the items found in his home and storage lockers was a general exploratory search from one object to another until something incriminating showed up. Sadly, this entire ordeal just kind of highlights the utter tragedy of this situation. Without any legal training or a law degree of any kind, Mike DeBardeleben was able to craft a compelling argument and go toe-to-toe with federal prosecutors on the finer details of their case, with the judge overseeing this case later telling author Stephen Micheal, "He was so knowledgeable. He knew his case better than anyone in the world. He was ready and he hit his points. He was, in a way, a brilliant litigator." Regardless, in late March of 1985, DeBardeleben's motion to suppress evidence was rejected, and the trial was scheduled for weeks later in April. During it, the woman I've been calling Lori Jensen would testify, something that was far from an easy task. Her first time hearing the audio recording of her abuse at Mike DeBardeleben's hands, Lori had had a pretty rough reaction. Yet, with her testimony, Lori would have to listen to that in open court, in front of dozens of people, and would have to do so in front of her attacker, who had positioned himself as his own counsel, meaning that he would get to directly speak to her. When she was called to testify, Lori struggled to recount her painful and traumatic experience from roughly 6 years prior, but she did so valiantly, answering each and every question to the best of her ability. While she was unable to positively identify DeBardeleben as her attacker because of the specific circumstances of the abduction, she was able to identify herself as the woman being assaulted in the photos and the recording that he had made. Then came cross-examination, where Mike DeBardeleben questioned her and seemed to relish the chance to speak to her. Yet Lori held strong, rarely looking at DeBardeleben throughout, keeping her eyes peeled away from him but answering every question succinctly and framing him as the culprit. After that, the rest of the trial proceeded pretty unevenly. The prosecution presented not just photographic and audio proof, but numerous journal entries from DeBardeleben in which he had written down Lori's real name, along with the names of other women that he had attacked in the months before and after. Prosecutors even compared pictures DeBardeleben had taken of his victims, and compared them to the nude photos of DeBardeleben that the Secret Service had taken shortly after his arrest. Through these, they were able to positively identify Mike DeBardeleben's body as the male figure seen in the pictures of abuse and torture. That, paired with vocal recognition from the audio recordings, successfully linked him to the crime. It was a pretty damning case, and because DeBardeleben continued to insist that his rights had been violated in the evidence selection process, he refused to view or directly address the evidence itself. It was a glaring oversight that might have been caught by a practicing lawyer, but hey, I guess you get the legal representation that you pay for. Instead, during his defense, Mike DeBardeleben continued to hammer on the perceived wrongdoing he felt the government had done in seizing his property, which was not a very convincing argument for this jury. The brief trial wrapped up in early May 1985, and the jury spent little time determining that Mike DeBardeleben was guilty of federal kidnapping, having abducted the victim in Maryland and transporting her across state lines into Virginia. Sentencing would take place just a few weeks later, and during it, Judge Walter E. Black imposed his sentence with a warning, telling Mike DeBardeleben, "The court needs to protect the public from further crimes by you." With that, he laid down the hammer, figuratively speaking, of course. "Release of this defendant at any time will threaten every woman in this country. In addition, the damage it would do the victim if she ever knew that this defendant was once more free in this country would be incalculable." Mike DeBardeleben was sentenced to 180 years in prison for this single kidnapping conviction, and would not be eligible for parole for 59 years. And because this was a separate conviction from his counterfeiting crimes, this would be served consecutively to his other 135 years. Meaning that Mike DeBardeleben, who was 45 years old at the time, was now sentenced to 315 years in federal prison. Now, we're going to pause for just a moment to hear a word from the sponsors that support this show. This series of legal victories had ensured at least a couple of things. First, that Mike DeBardeleben would spend the rest of his life in prison, because none of the sentences ran concurrently. If one jurisdiction were to parole him or otherwise grant him early release, then the others would undoubtedly get him scooped up and have him spend the rest of his life there. He had been sentenced to 35 years in Tennessee, 100 years in North Carolina, and 180 years in Maryland. It was highly unlikely he would ever be a free man again. Secondly, though, and perhaps most importantly, these legal victories ensured that most other jurisdictions would shy away from trying DeBardeleben in the future. After all, he had just been sentenced to 315 years in prison. What use was it to prosecutors to spend time and resources convicting a man that was already destined to a life sentence? When told what the surviving victim from Maryland had to endure during her trial, reliving her worst moments in front of a packed courtroom, getting cross-examined by Mike DeBardeleben, hell, simply having to breathe the same air as him again, many of the other victims chose to avoid pursuing charges any further. So their cases simply wilted away, never to be touched again. This included the murder trials from Louisiana and Rhode Island, where prosecutors worried that they did not have enough evidence to convict DeBardeleben. So the murder cases of Jean McFall and Terry McDonald were closed. Investigators and prosecutors believing that Mike DeBardeleben had been their killer, but their loved ones and communities would never get the closure of knowing for sure. Yet, some of these cases would limp on, adding on to DeBardeleben's exaggerated sentence, which was now starting to look more like the high score in a video game than actual years in prison. In 1986, DeBardeleben would stand trial in New Jersey for the abduction and sexual assault of a store clerk, whose story I detailed in the last episode. That trial unfolded incredibly similar to the last one in Maryland, with DeBardeleben serving as his own attorney and being allowed to cross-examine the survivor. But this time he found himself at the whims of a much less open-minded judge, who was more than willing to take him to task for his theatrics, none of which proved to be effective. In May of that year, Mike DeBardeleben was sentenced to 60 additional years in prison, bringing his grand total up to 375 years. Later that same year, in November of 1986, DeBardeleben was charged with the sexual assault of a young woman from 1981, a crime that I haven't yet recounted in this series, but one that was incredibly similar to so many of the others. In February of 1981, a young woman in Manassas, Virginia had been pulled over by a man posing as a police officer, who then got into the woman's car and forced her to perform oral sex on him under threat of death. Afterward, he returned her back to her car and let her go, but she got the last laugh nearly 6 years later. This trial in Virginia would unfold throughout 1987, following several continuances, all of which were requested by the now 47-year-old Mike DeBardeleben, still acting as his own attorney. Yet, the end result was the same as the others. DeBardeleben was found guilty of abducting the woman while impersonating a police officer and then sexually assaulting her. During the trial, he had actually made a fatal mistake, admitting knowledge of the suspect's car that had not been described by the victim in any of her reports. Instead, the description matched DeBardeleben's own vehicle at the time, a rare oversight that the prosecutors then pounced on. It was one of the most major gaffes made by DeBardeleben over the years, and it's only fitting that it was a self-inflicted one. At the resolution of that trial in 1987, the judge imposed the sentence recommended by the jury: 2 life sentences, the maximum allowed under the law. They, like the other sentences he'd received, would be served consecutively. This brought his total time in prison up to 375 years, plus 2 life sentences, which, if you add the numbers, carry the X, you get, well, if you're Mike DeBardeleben, you get fucked. Following his arrest in May of 1983, Mike DeBardeleben would spend the rest of his life incarcerated. During his various trials, he was moved through local and state jails pretty frequently, but he would spend most of the final half of his life in and out of federal prisons. At first, he spent some time at the U.S. Penitentiary in Lompoc, California, but he would get to settle in semi-permanently at the Supermax facility at ADX Florence in Colorado, which is often where the worst of the worst are kept. There, he fit in quite nicely. At the time of his final conviction in 1987, DeBardeleben was the primary suspect in at least 3 unsolved murders, including those described throughout the series: the 1971 murder of Terry McDonald in Rhode Island, the 1982 slaying of Jean McFall in Louisiana, and the 1983 killing of Joe Rapini in New York. However, because of his extended life sentence, prosecutors did not think it was worth their time to file charges in any of those cases, regardless of the evidence they had against DeBardeleben. For that reason, no additional charges would ever get filed against him. In addition to these 3 murders, Mike DeBardeleben was also loosely suspected of involvement in at least a few others. This included the mysterious death of Rhoda Piazza, aka Rhoda Fizel, an exotic dancer that disappeared in Beaumont, Texas in April 1983, later found lying naked in a ditch. She had been bound extensively before her death, and had also been tortured and beaten severely, with investigators noting burns across her body and whip marks from a belt all over her skin. She had likely also been sexually assaulted, but the autopsy and subsequent investigation were handled incredibly poorly, with investigators unable to recover much in the way of forensic evidence. As I mentioned, the investigation into Rhoda's death was significantly botched, so hope of closure did not last long. Yet, DeBardeleben found himself becoming a primary suspect in the case, because a license plate found in his possession had been stolen from a lot at roughly the same time Rhoda originally went missing, not too far away from where her body was found. Her disappearance and death also took place in April, which is when investigators noted DeBardeleben's violent crimes went on the uptick, that time of year likely having some significance to him. For a time, DeBardeleben was also linked to the disappearance of 25-year-old Mary Bobo Shin, an art teacher from Magnolia, Arkansas, who also dabbled in real estate. She disappeared in July of 1978, at around the same time Mike DeBardeleben was released from prison, and her vehicle was later found abandoned and in a state of disarray. Yet, Bobo Shin would never be found. Her remains were never recovered, and no crime scene was ever located. It remains unknown who committed the crime, but investigators eventually linked it to the murder of Jean McFall through some similarities. But that remains unknown more than 40 years later. DeBardeleben was also loosely linked to the disappearance of 17-year-old Kelly Marie Brownlee, who disappeared from the 12 Oaks Mall in Novi, Michigan after skipping school and hitchhiking with her boyfriend in May of 1982. Despite some publications claiming that he was eventually ruled out as a suspect, DeBardeleben was suspected of involvement in that case for quite some time, and it remains unknown what happened to Kelly after her disappearance. Behind bars, Mike DeBardeleben would quickly get used to his meager existence, but continued to be a profoundly unpleasant and despicable person. He never talked to investigators or journalists about his crimes, and he refused to admit to anything throughout the rest of his life. Eventually, some of the children that he had abandoned years beforehand made an attempt to reconnect with him. As noted by author Stephen Micheal in his books Lethal Shadow and Beyond Cruel, however, they would find nothing of value behind his eyes. Instead, one of his daughters, who knew little of his actual case, began writing him and even went out to visit him, something she would only do once. As Micheal himself first wrote about in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram and then adapted into the epilogue of his book, this daughter told him, "This was an emotional moment. I didn't know what to expect. All these years of curiosity and wonder, it all came together in this person sitting next to me, who didn't look anything like what I expected. He just looked bad, unhealthy, and he didn't talk at all in the way I expected. His countenance was not what I expected. His eyes were like nothing I'd ever seen. It felt as though I was looking at the devil. The only word that comes to mind is disgust. Something inside of me wanted to puke, for want of a better word." Mike DeBardeleben's health issues, which had been debilitating and painful even as a young man, had only been exacerbated by his frequent drug use and nomadic lifestyle, and became even more pronounced due to his lengthy prison sentence and age. After being transferred to the Federal Medical Center in North Carolina, he died of pneumonia on January 26, 2011. More than 4 decades have passed since Mike DeBardeleben's arrest in May of 1983, yet the mystery of his life and crimes continues to loom large over those that know of him, with him having impacted so many people in such a relatively short amount of time. Yet, for some reason, he remains something of an unknown. Many of us know the names Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy, yet Mike DeBardeleben has somehow been forgotten to time. Probably because he was only ever convicted of a handful of crimes, half of those being counterfeit offenses. Yet those familiar with his case still consider him to be one of the scariest criminals to ever walk among us. A man that was suspected of involvement in several robberies, frauds, kidnappings, rapes, assaults, and murders, most of which remain unsolved. In fact, the only significant crime that federal investigators never linked to him was arson, showing that there was almost no low he wouldn't stoop to in an effort to advance his own interest. For that reason, when the DSM-4 came out in 1994, it used him as an example for both sadistic personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder, since he was the clearest example of both discovered in the wild up to that point in time. And to this day, he remains the perfect specimen to highlight both disorders. The Secret Service task force that investigated DeBardeleben's many crimes disbanded in 1990, and with it, a lot of the momentum to figure out what exactly he had done over the years evaporated with them. Because DeBardeleben was already serving such a lengthy prison stint for his many crimes, no authorities wanted to waste their time or resources pursuing additional charges against him. Not when they could simply close their case file and say that the matter was settled, leaving many cases closed but without any closure. Mike Stevens, one of the Secret Service agents that helped spearhead the task force, later recalled to the Potomac News, "I did everything I could, as well as the other investigators, to put him on death row where he belongs." Yet, sadly, no additional charges would follow after DeBardeleben's final conviction in 1987. After that came a series of appeals by him, all of which were unsuccessful, but none of the other charges he was linked to, the kidnappings, the rapes, the murders, would ever get officially solved. Like Henry Lee Lucas before him, once Mike DeBardeleben was linked to a case, investigators just kind of stopped looking into them. At some point in the 1980s, Mike DeBardeleben was suspected of involvement in dozens of additional crimes, yet investigators have not spoken openly about him or his suspected crimes since then. The women that were unidentified in the photographs and audio recordings remain unidentified to this day. For obvious reasons, none of this information has ever been published in a public forum, but it is likely, if not probable, that Mike DeBardeleben had many more victims whose identities or names remain unknown. It's possible that some are missing persons cases from the 1970s or early 1980s, or potentially even unsolved murders from the same era. FBI profilers once believed it unlikely that he would take an 11-year break from killing between 1971 and 1982, when his criminal behavior started to seriously escalate. And there's still a lot of time in that span that remains unaccounted for when it comes to Mike DeBardeleben. So, who's to say what he was up to exactly? I can only hope that this man's various victims and their loved ones have been able to achieve peace in the many years since he traversed this country, as not just the mall passer, but as a serial rapist and killer. I hope that this countless number of people have been able to find calm and happiness in the decades since his arrest, and in the 13 years since his death. I also feel profoundly for those who were deprived of either justice or resolution, which, because of this man's broad criminal scope, is likely a large number, the likes of which we'll never know for sure. For that reason, I still consider this story to be unresolved. Thank you all for listening to Unresolved. I am your host, Micheal Whelan. This episode was researched, written, and produced by myself. I also put together the music heard throughout the episode, except where noted in the show notes. This is a story that I would like to investigate more in the future. I feel like there's a lot of untapped potential here for a really deep dive. At least as long as federal agencies are a little receptive to the idea, which is a big if in cases like this. It's worth a shot at the very least, but for now, my time digging into Mike DeBardeleben on this podcast has come to a close. Before we go, I would like to thank the amazing producers of Unresolved, who support this show each month on Patreon. These wonderful people are Roberta Jansen, Sarah Moscaratolo, Ben Crocum, Jacinda Klass, Alex Kalergopoulos, Crystal J, Derek Smith, Heather Fiddler, James Weiss, Lauren Nicole, Marion Welsh, Patrick Loxo, Ridis Bauza, Scott Nisi, Stephen Diaz, and Zach Cass. Thank you all for your continued patronage. It really does help keep this show going. I'd also like to thank the rest of the patrons who support this show each month on Patreon. You can become a producer or a patron by heading to patreon.com/unresolvedpod, where you can get access to commercial-free episodes, our entire archive of bonus episodes, and every episode of the Patreon-exclusive show, Resolved. There, I take a look at solved cases, such as the story of a man who turned to Reddit for help with his cheating wife, only to lose his entire family. That's actually a really sad one, but it's also a really informative look at postpartum depression and the role that the internet plays in our everyday lives. I also cover some unique short mysteries on the Patreon, such as an infamous hacker in the late 1990s that went by the name Maxis, or the identities of an early 1980s hair metal band called either Steel Assassin or Steve Assassin. That's a fun one. Anyhow, all of that and more is only available on the Patreon. If you would like for this show to keep going, please continue to spread word of it with your friends, family, or anywhere else you could think of. Reddit, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, wherever. I also do appreciate your reviews. Those are always appreciated. As I've mentioned beforehand, the podcast industry as a whole is going through some significant overhauls, which is why so many of your other favorite shows are coming to an end. With the explosion of podcast popularity and the emergence of celebrities into this sphere, it's making it a lot harder for us regular independent folk to keep things going. Please show your support for independent podcast however you can. Well, that just about does it for me. I may be taking next week off from the regular feed to reset and try and catch up on some Patreon stuff, but I should be back with another new episode very soon. Until then, I hope you all stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll talk to you all later.